Very good evening to all of you friends. Well, today we are going to have a very exciting talk with Miel, Preeti, and Amandeep. Over the years, we have damaged and mutilated our earth so much. This has led to a total ecological imbalance. Floods, glacier bursts, earthquakes, and innumerable calamities are becoming the norm. An escalating climate crisis further worsened by COVID 19. What sort of world are we going to leave behind our children? As educators, we have an important role to play in shaping the world for future generations. While we are fortunate that today's youth is conscious and sensitive to their surroundings, it is crucial to help them better understand what will help heal the earth. To that end, we are delighted to join hands with some crusaders in this field. The Sanctuary Nature Foundation will be represented by Miel Seigel, a writer and editor who has spent over 2 decades with Sanctuary magazine, Preeti Takle, an environmental educationist, teacher trainer, and urban organic farmer, and Amandeep Kaur Bamra, a wildlife and nature educator and the national coordinator for Kids for Tigers. So, without taking up more of your time, over to you, Miel.
Thank you, Sonia and Nandita, for having us today. We're quite excited to share what we all feel so passionately about. If Preeti, if you could just take me to this next slide, I'll do a quick overview of what we're going to cover today and then hand over to Preeti from there. So, where we are in 2021, after a very strange year that has certainly put us, human species, put us in our place, so to speak. It's made us understand that we are not that special and we're not that different, and we really are a part of this whole. And how we mess with it has direct implications for us. So, today, very quickly, we'll just go through only a few 10,000 years of our human history very fast. Remind ourselves how we've always understood that we're a part of nature, that how inseparable we are from nature, but yet along the way we got lost as a species. And what is the impact of this losing our way and disconnecting from the very fabric of life? Once we understand a little bit of where our disconnection has brought us today, we will spend maybe 10 minutes or so really exploring why it's so important to reconnect, not just for healing the earth or saving the earth, but ourselves. What does it do for us as individuals? What does it do for our children? What does it do for communities, societies, and the earth as a whole? And then we'll wrap up with a discussion on how educators can be part of the solution. We will run through a few of the things that Preeti and Amandeep have really had some great success with through this Kids for Tigers program in terms of activities, but we'll just touch lightly on them and really hope that we can engage with all of you educators, parents, to talk about what you feel might really contribute. We can share these ideas with each other. So I would like to maybe start at the very beginning where life all began, deep in the ocean. Preeti?
Yes, thanks, Mia. So, as everyone knows, life emerged in the oceans initially as single celled organisms, and then, we evolved. And this, though it happened very slowly, I'm going to be talking a little rapidly about it. And, we evolved, emerged in the oceans, and eventually from the water, we as animals or creatures conquered land and began to inhabit land. And when we began to inhabit land, our requirements also were a little different. We needed food, we needed water, we needed shelter, and who else than the earth to provide us with all of this? Now, this empty land or emptiness of the glaciers that you see in this picture is not actually without meaning, because it is not just a wild, inhospitable, inhabitable, empty place, but it is actually our water bank, which is which can supply 1/5 of humanity with fresh water. So we need these stores, we need these to be intact. And it is this connection, this understanding and this connection with our roots that we need to preserve. Similarly, when we look at these forests, they seem impenetrable. They seem to be just, standing there, occupying space when we could be having agriculture and factories and homes and whatever over there. But in fact, these forests are extremely important because they absorb or they staunch the monsoon. We have a very short monsoon period. Being close to the equator, we have a defined monsoon season, and we need to collect and garner all that water that falls in those 3 to 4 months to sustain us through the rest of the year until the next monsoon arrives, hopefully on time and with enough water for us. So these forests are actually doing this work where they are slowing down the flow of water. They are allowing the water to go into aquifers because it seeps underground, gets filtered and stored underground where it does not evaporate. And we are accessing water. The groundwater that we access is actually millions of years old. And just to think of it, that it has been there for centuries, and we are now, kind of running through it very, very rapidly. So water is life, and just as the forests staunch the rainfall and allow water to seep underground, the rivers that flow on the surface or the streams that flow on the surface are equally crucial because they supply us with fresh water, not just human beings, but the forests and the creatures that inhabit the forest. So without this clean water for us to drink daily, it would be a near impossibility to survive on this planet. And somewhere along the way, our ancestors always knew that the tiger is the striped water god. In Hindi, a lot of people in that live close to the forests have been calling it Pattedar Pani Ka Devta. And the reason being that if the tiger inhabited the forest was secure. And if the forest was secure, the water supply was secure. So they worshipped the tiger in order to keep the tiger alive in the forest and hence ensured that they had enough water supply. Also, seeing the tiger in a forest meant that there was enough water because the tigers, if you remember, came from Siberia and Central Asia, which are very cold countries, areas. And as they moved south into India, they felt the need of cooling off in water bodies during the hot summers of the central plains that they inhabit in India. So there is a dual reason that tigers and water go together. One, because they require water themselves, and B, we keep them there by worshipping them. Our ancestors kept them alive by worshipping them so that human beings had a guaranteed supply of water. This beautiful creature, gentle giant as he is called, I think he is one of my most favorite animals. And this creature is truly the gardener of Eden, and Eden being all our wonderful forests that this elephant inhabits, along with the tiger and the leopard and so many other creatures. So the story of this gardener, how is he a gardener? It is simple. He eats, he eats fruits, he eats grass, he poops, and the seeds germinate because he passes those seeds out without digestion. Second way is where when he walks through dense forests, he has to clear a path to allow himself and his herd to pass through. The matriarch will clear the way and the herd follows. And in this clearing, there are seeds that are lying dormant on the ground, waiting for sunlight to reach them. And the moment they feel the warmth of the sun, they begin germinating and new trees grow. So there is two ways in which that this elephant is actually nurturing the forests and giving chance to newer seeds and newer trees to bloom. Well, the circle of life would not be complete without the decomposers. These are extremely important. And for a moment, if you imagine the world without decomposers, without bacteria, without fungi, who was going to dispose of all the dead organic matter that would be littered on the planet's surface? It is these small, tiny creatures that break down organic matter into elemental substances and return them to the soil. And it is this recycling that happens, which is actually, again, adding to the plentiful feeling and the plentiness that the earth has within itself to regenerate and regrow. So without these decomposers, we would be nowhere, and they are extremely, extremely important. And this, I think, is a very, very beautiful picture of a luminescent mushroom. And I mean, I have never seen one in real life, but this is something that will make me want to go out and look for one. So the whole idea is that Mother Nature actually cares for all of us. If we stop to think, everything that we require is provided by nature, everything that we require or need to survive comes from nature. So Mother Nature is there for all the creatures that inhabit the planet. But there is a little condition there, and that is, if we are going to walk hand in hand with nature, we are going to have enough. So as I keep telling the kids that Mother Nature is the true superhero. So if we have Mother Nature on our side, then we have nothing to worry, because we are going to be safe in her hands. And that is precisely what this picture tells you. This gharial with all the babies on her back is a true metaphor for Mother Nature, who's carrying all of us for so many years. Now, as I said, all this was understood at some point by all the creatures on this planet, including humans. But as we grew, as we developed, as we invented, we somewhere lost track, lost our way, and began to believe that we are superior to the rest of the creatures on this earth. And that was where we lost our way. And the Industrial Revolution happened, and thereafter things moved very, very rapidly in terms of development, in terms of inventions, and in terms of shrinking the world into a global village, and all the paraphernalia that goes along with it, the consumerism, the travel, the fossil fuels, all of it. You know, it's like it just it just boomed. And somewhere along the way, we began to believe that that was the best way, when it really wasn't. So I wouldn't blame those people for what they did, because they probably didn't know what they were doing at that point in time. But now that we know about it, we need to figure out what we are going to do to correct what was not right. So what happened was, under the influence of development, or the need for development, the need to accommodate a growing population, the need to supply the demand of a growing population, forests were cut down. There was monoculture, like the palm oil plantations that are happening in Southeast Asia. That began to happen. A lot of forests were cut down for mining purposes, where coal was mined to supply our thermal power plant so that we get electricity and we live in comfort. But the result of this was that a lot of fossil fuel emissions were out there in the atmosphere, causing global warming, causing the climate to change far more rapidly than it would have done if all of this was proceeding at nature's pace. We have hastened the pace of all of this. And that is why today what we are looking at is sometimes forest fires that break out at even with the smallest of sparks. The forests are tinder dry in summer, and the smallest of sparks can set off a fire, which rages for weeks. We also have seas that are full of trash that we ourselves have thrown. And I wouldn't be surprised if we are consuming some of the trash again, if we are non-vegetarians and fish eaters, because some of the microplastics are consumed by the fish. And well, we could still be eating our own trash. So that is a thought that comes to my mind every time I look at a fish that my fish wali is carrying in a basket. Um, the other problem is your wet markets, poaching, hunting, this whole thing about human beings trying to control things. So the wet markets are where animals from the wild are brought into the markets and sold, either alive to be caged and kept as, as some status symbol, or their body parts are sold to people who make medicines out of it, supposedly. I don't know how effective those medicines are, but that is what is being done. There are trophies like the one you're seeing in the photograph here, the other one, where people have hunted animals as a sport. And I do not understand how any killing of any other creature can be a sport. Because if the animal kills us, then we promptly start shouting man eater. But what about us who go into the forest and harm these animals? So that is another cause for depleting animal populations. Though fortunately now hunting as a sport is almost not there. But poaching is a big problem, where elephants are hunted and killed for their tusks and ivory. You also have overfishing in the seas, where a lot of fish which is caught may not be consumed. It's just wasted because it's bycatch. And overfishing has also depleted our fish resources. So very soon, a big chunk of protein that people depend on as a food source is going to be vanishing from our oceans. Somewhere along the way, we also forgot that had we not evolved in the direction that we took as Homo sapiens, we would probably be something like what our closest relative, the chimpanzees, are. And probably some other species would have taken precedence and moved ahead. We don't know, but as it stands now, uh, we are not sparing our closest relative either. They are being slaughtered, they are being killed, and one doesn't know why, one doesn't understand why you need to kill chimpanzees. What is the purpose? But yes, they are being hunted to extinction in the countries that are mentioned in the slide. And um, well, rhinoceros is another animal which is being poached. Uh, the horn of the rhinoceros is used in traditional Chinese medicine. It is all, it is a horn made out of keratin, which is there in your nails. So why can't we use our fingernails for medicine? Why do we need the rhinoceros horn? This is a thought that comes to my mind, but uh, that is how it is. And these are uh, animals that need to be kept alive, because these are very few in number, and they, if they disappear from the from the forest they inhabit, the balance of that forest is going to be upset, and we don't know what turn it will take next. This is the most trafficked animal. It is the pangolin, or the scaly anteater. And these are traded or sold for the scales. Okay, it is the scales that are the most wanted thing of that animal. And these have probably served as the intermediate host in the current COVID crisis, where the virus jumped from the bat to the pangolin and then from there to human beings. So this is something that we need to keep in mind, that when we are dealing with wildlife, we are exposing ourselves to viruses that would have otherwise never come to us if they were in the forest. So COVID-19 is not something that has happened for the first time. In the sense, a zoonotic disease has happened before. Only the scale on which it has happened this time is probably different from the earlier diseases like Ebola or SARS. One could limit those epidemics, one could contain those epidemics, but plague went out of hand. Similarly, tuberculosis at one point was out of hand. Today, corona is out of hand, and it is only because of our close interaction with wildlife. We need to keep in mind that parasites jump from one animal to another, and that includes human beings. We are also animals, if you actually look at it. So we cannot exclude ourselves from being susceptible to these diseases. So while the slaughtering of wildlife continues, we cannot expect to stay away from pandemics. So it's actually very, very necessary that we keep a distance, a safe distance between us and wildlife. and not project ourselves as victims of nature. It's in fact the other way around, because we are encroaching on the animal space in the forests and taking away space from them. So it's actually important that we maintain this distance and restore the ecosystems in which these animals live. We also need to understand that disasters that are happening of late, these are warnings, and Mother Nature has been sending out these warnings for some years now, in the form of typhoons, in the form of cyclones, in the form of forest fires. And the most recent one in India was the Chamoli disaster, where the glacier burst led to the wall breaking and flooding the river, and of course causing great destruction. This is not entirely because of nature, but human induced as well. So nature has been sending out messages. Now it's time we heeded those messages and we listened to them, listened carefully, and took steps to correct our direction and what we are doing. So protecting nature is very important, and if we protect nature, nature will protect us. But the question is, how do we go about doing this? The answer to that is very simple. All that nature requires is half. And what is this half? But half the space on the planet. Okay, half the space on this planet. If we leave to nature, nature is going to revive itself, heal itself, and regenerate itself. So we don't have to do much, but just leave it alone, leave the space to regenerate itself. So in India, we have 18 biosphere reserves, 668 protected areas. But the biosphere reserves are the important ones, because these are huge areas of forests, which include several national parks and sanctuaries within their boundary. They also have space for human habitation. They also have space for sustainable industry to take place. So it's not that when we say protect nature, we are excluding human beings, we're excluding development, and we're excluding human industry. We're not doing that. But all that we're saying is that we need to make it sustainable. And it is these large swathes of forests that are there as biosphere reserves that are actually sequestering a lot of carbon, that are actually storing carbon in the trees that are growing in those forests. If the tree is cut, it is going to be used for various purposes, and it is going to release all that stored carbon into the atmosphere. So that is something we need to bear in mind. And if we have these protected areas, we are going to be able to give a fighting chance to India in the climate change crisis. So Miel, I hand over now to you to talk about how we can reconnect with nature after all the doomsday sayings that I have had.
Thank you, Preeti. It's actually, funnily enough, not all doomsday, because so much of our history has been spent in such harmony with the entire system of which we are part. And like a tiny fraction of history has sort of led us down this terrible path. And all of us, I think, really do believe that, particularly when we involve the kids, working towards a positive shift is very possible. Since we're all educators, parents here, I thought we can start with the human baby. Our human minds, our bodies have not changed too much since what they call the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. This is, say, at a time when we were foragers, hunter-gatherers. We are still quite biologically similar. Our brains are similar, our bodies are similar to what they were then. The problem that's happened is that our physical environment and our day-to-day life has changed so dramatically that there is a slight out of sync disconnect between what we were designed for and the lives we were living. So as educators and parents, an important thing for us to consider is that how do we get ourselves slightly more back in sync with our true natures? So kids today, we're little primates, right? They're monkey babies, they're ape babies. We're not designed to spend all that time indoors. We're not supposed to be sort of watched and managed and coerced into these sort of resume fattening lifestyles that all of our children are these days, and surrounded by things that are made by human beings. Everything, you know, your desktop, your TV, your table, chair, you know, even the ground underfoot is cement and tile. And we have physically, our little primates are so disconnected from what they were biologically designed for, that it's time for us to start thinking about how do we slightly get them back aligned. Preeti, one of the first things that we need to keep front of mind, and this is something that I learned so much from Nandita and Sonia and Lekha and all of you when I had a little, my primate was quite young, is that we were designed as babies, as little ones, to play. That is absolutely how we learn. You know, we're born, we can go into the biology of it, but human beings are sort of born a little bit earlier than they should be. And they have to learn a lot on the go. And play is how we're designed to learn everything. It's free, unstructured play. If you watch educators, you must know this. If you watch them and you leave them to their own devices, they're not behaving that very differently from other kinds of primates, you know, whether it's their social learning or whether it's mastering their fear, or what they're doing is all through exploration, it's discovery, it's trial and error. Preeti, huh? So yes, we need them to play, but when we allow them to play outdoors and in nature, there's a different kind of magic that happens. There's this theory that human beings have an intrinsic, inherent connection to nature. We have an affinity for nature, and our kids are no different. So when you have children and just put them out into the outdoors, they instinctively feel this curiosity and awe and joy and love. And we don't need to tell them. We don't need to tell a child, oh, this is a very pretty butterfly, or this is you just leave them out there at this very young age and they do it. In fact, just yesterday, I was at a park and near a playground, and I met these two parents with their 2-year-old, 3-year-old maybe. And they said, oh, we were at the swings and slides and all, but she doesn't want to be there. She's just here. And while I was chatting with them, I saw she was just squatting on the floor and picking at the grass and poking in the mud and doing nothing. We were talking for a good 5 minutes. She was just sitting there. Suddenly she looks up to me and she said, and I don't know this baby. And she looks up to me and she said, I'm planting trees. And I thought, look at her mind. She's having this wonderful, nobody told her it's good to plant trees and you have to save the earth. Nobody has given her that. She's just playing in the grass and the mud, and that's her experience. So that inherent connection we have, all of us, it's just there. The Japanese have this thing called forest bathing. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of Shinrin-yoku, that we actually have a biochemical exchange with trees when we're out there. And that makes us feel good without us actively having to use our neocortex thinking brain to realize that we're doing ourselves some good, right? And kids are just the same. So we need to just get them out there. Preeti? Yeah. However, what has happened with this disconnection that we're talking about, this separation, this sort of othering from nature, is that we have an unfortunate syndrome that this wonderful man called Richard Louv actually coined this term. He wrote this book, Last Child in the Woods. And he coined this term called nature deficit disorder, which is actually being considered as a disorder now, because, and we'll go into this later, because of all the benefits that a nature connection has for us. So what we have to try and do is overcome this. How do we overcome this? Because there are consequences, there are physiological in our body, there is psychological, there's mental health issues, and there are spiritual consequences to our disconnection. So let's think about how we go beyond them, right? I have a bunch of resources here if anybody wants to know a little bit more about the studies, but basically this is just a smattering of the few of the proven, scientifically proven benefits that children sort of benefit from when they are connected with nature. There are distinct health benefits, whether it's cardiovascular, respiratory, all of that, which logically would make sense to us, right? When you're out in nature, you're breathing cleaner air, you're probably running about more, all of that. They've done studies on kids with ADHD and how it works with nature exposure. There's also with animals, what the being with animals does to kids with attention issues. There's been instances of better academic performance when we have an opportunity to go in and out of our classrooms and our homes as opposed to just stuck indoors. And like any of us know, when we were in lockdown, we can see it in ourselves, we can see it in our children. What is the stress level when you're caged within 4 cement walls as opposed to when you're allowed to get outside, or frankly even connect with the tree outside your window? And like we said, the moods, the stress. And there's a spiritual grounding. There is something that we don't necessarily need to put into words, but we feel when we're in nature. And to deny our children that is almost criminal, that we need to be able to get them out there. So the first point is that if our kids are not connected, how are they going to take on this role of environmental stewardship? We have the advantage of remaining oblivious while the destruction that Preeti discussed sort of went on, right? But our kids have been thrown into the peak of this crisis. They have no option but to look after the mess that we have left for them. And how do we create this generation of kids who are ready to face not only a very unstable world, but to heal it? So if as educationists, our aim is to say, yes, we understand that we need this nature connection for a range of reasons. And also we want to create a generation that cares about the earth. There have been studies done by this woman called Louise Chawla. I followed some of her work. And she sort of looked at what really creates an environmentalist. If your aim is, okay, I want to teach EVS, I want to create a generation of kids who are motivated to help protect the earth and ourselves, what really does the trick? And what they found is that there are two sort of outstanding factors there. One is that if they have positive experiences in natural areas. So this is not somebody telling you in class that, you know, there's polar bears are dying and the tigers are being slaughtered. That has its place, but that doesn't necessarily create that environmentalism when you have a very exposure at a very young age. It's a positive experience in natural areas. Natural areas means you can go to a wildlife or sanctuary, or you can just go and look at the trees in your compound and walk around in a park. But if you are free to play in wild areas, in your early childhood, there's a very high chance you're going to grow up into someone who cares about taking environmental action. And the other thing is an inspiring adult role model. It can be one, it can be several, but it's monkey see, monkey do. If we see, as when we're young children, if we see someone who cares, it helps sort of catalyze that feeling in us. Rachel Carson, who a lot of people talk about her as sort of the mother of Western environmentalism, and Louise Chawla, who's done these studies, and several others, they've said that direct experiences in nature, where it is a sensory and emotional experience, where you are with that dog or cat, or you're alone with that plant or tree or all of those things. And again, I'm repeating this because it's so important, this sense of wonder, and it's so intrinsically natural the way it appears in children, that we must not deny them this. Direct experiences in nature with an emotional and sensory connection and an inspirational adult. So when we study EVS in school, does that do the same trick? Can we create tomorrow's Earth defenders by teaching them EVS in school? There are a couple of caveats here. Environmental education is happening in a classroom. You're not very often. I know there are a lot of educators here who are probably taking their kids out pre-lockdown and all of that. But very often there's textbook environmental education, right? It's all facts. Memorize these facts. This is what happened. That is what happened. This is the problem. It's something is happening in the Amazon. I'm sitting in Mumbai city. I know Sanjay Gandhi National Park is here. I know there are 3 trees in my neighborhood, but I have to study what's happening in South America somewhere. And it's problems. It's not relevant to my life. And where are the solutions, right? And very often it is negative information. And this, while reality is important for certain age groups up, very young children, exposing them to very negative emotions and negative information can have the opposite consequences than what we intend. So what happens is that instead of the biophilia, we have ecophobia. If the exposure is too young to negativity, right? You feel powerless. You're 5 years old and you're seeing a bloody tiger and an elephant with its tusks cut off, or you're seeing this polar bear on this tiny little bit of ice. You feel powerless, right? And there's anxiety that starts happening in these kids. So you have this thing called ecophobia that sets in. I'm sorry, does that sound disturbing you? We'll carry on. That's the sound of Bombay. Okay. So you have ecophobia that sets in. And again, studies have shown, which are really interesting and sad, that when a child is exposed to the abuse of Mother Earth, they shut down their emotional connection the similar way that they would when they're exposed to the abuse of any other kind, verbal abuse, physical abuse. So you don't expand your heart and love that, you get afraid and you push it away. And also, as we know, the opposite of love is not hate, it's fear. Even in human societies, when you fear the other, right? That's what hate is. So if you're going to teach children to fear nature and have fear-related connections with it, you're not going to create the love that you need in order to then grow up into kids who are going to protect it eventually. So what we try to do is then let's talk about age-appropriate environmental education, right? So it's not necessarily, age doesn't mean I am 4 years and 27 days, therefore I will do this. No, it's a stage, it's a level of maturity. So these are very rough guidelines for you to know that there may be some of your 7-year-olds. I know a 5-year-old who is ready for environmental action, but I know 15-year-olds or myself, an almost 50-year-old who are very sensitive and they don't necessarily thrive in an environment that's very strongly activist or negative, right? So let's go by age appropriate guidelines, keeping individual preferences in mind. Early childhood is the best time for focusing on empathy. They have a natural empathy. They just need to sit over there and watch that caterpillar. They need to sit over there and pet that whatever animal their parents allow them to pet. Middle childhood is when you get more into the phase of exploration and you want to go out and discover things and you want the hikes and the trails and stuff like that. And early adolescence usually is the best time for more social activism and facing a lot of the negative. Again, the caveat here is some kids are ready for this earlier, but as we plan our activities, it's nicer to keep this rough age thing in mind. Like they said earlier, David Sobel, who's this wonderful man who came up with this idea of something called place-based education. He talks about relevance and he talks about context. He said, if you have to give them a chance to love it, let them fall in love when they're little. And by the time they are a little bit older, they will chase the knowledge themselves that they need in order to then protect it, right? So when you feel that love and empathy, you are primed to grow up. The science shows that this is how it works. The psychological studies show that this is how it works. The heart comes first, the head will follow. And when we love something, we will grow up to want to protect it. So what can we do? So it's really, if you highlight the magic, joy, wonder, something relevant to their daily context first, and then expose them to the global problems. Let's start with what's beautiful, joyous, and in my neighborhood first, and then go. Let's do hands-on experiences as far as possible. And Preeti and Aman will run you through some ideas, and I'm sure a lot of you have experiences as well that you'd like to share. And then let's involve those local naturalists, conservationists, those older adults who can then be inspirational and help them. So that's about it. Let them out there, expose them, and Preeti will, I'll hand over to you and Aman, who've had all your experiences with Kids for Tigers, which really uses the tiger just as a metaphor, but talks about the entire system. And talk a little about what kinds of things work, don't work, and then we can open it up to discussion after that. Over to you, Preeti. We need to unmute Preeti.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot. So, when we are talking about action, as Miel suggested, in the early childhood, what we require is to create a love and a sense of wonder in the child. And very often, I, as a preschool teacher, I have taught the preschool for several years, and I have always found that parents are wary of allowing the children to get their hands dirty, to get their clothes dirty, and they're worried about the germs that they will have on their hands and in their bodies. But little do they realize that it is this kind of exposure that is actually creating immunity in the children. They're allowing the children's natural immunity to flourish so that they fall ill less often. And also, the children enjoy being out in nature. So, whether it is playing in the sand pit, or it is just going around the school compound looking at the plants and trying to, as I've said, take bark prints. Just take a piece of paper, crayons, go around, and then compare the designs. There are so many different designs that will come up from the bark because each tree has a different bark. So they will have a set of designs, and you could then get them to collaborate and create something out of those designs. So you have a lot of apart from admiring nature, you are also then getting them into teamwork and collaboration, which is what any educator wants in the classroom. So you're bringing nature into the classroom, and nature in itself is trying to teach you how to collaborate and how to work together. Again, collecting flowers that are fallen on the ground, collecting leaves of different colors and different shapes. I think all of us as children have had these strange collections. I used to collect pebbles. I used to collect leaves of different shapes and sizes and put them into books and then forget about them for months. And then when I would pull out the book, out fell that leaf or out fell the flower. And I would say, oh, I had forgotten this was there. So why not actively teach them to press flowers and then use that creatively? This is something that will help them keep that connection alive when they go home. They have something to do, they have something to look forward to. Even leaf printing, using a crayon, the back of the leaf where the veins are more pronounced creates a design, or you dip the leaf in paint and print. Use it like a block print. And you can make torans and you can make designs. I have personally used these with the preschool children to create t-shirts, their own t-shirts with leaf prints and vegetable prints, so that they have a unique t-shirt of their own which they have designed. Yes, it is not perfect, but it is something that the kids enjoy thoroughly because each design is unique and it is their own creation. So, getting them to do these things in harmony with nature, probably out of the classroom. Carry all your material into your little garden space or into your quadrangle, which is got a shady corner, and sit in the shade of the tree and work with the children. It is amazing because suddenly you hear the chirp of a bird, or you see something which is crawling up the tree trunk, and you have a discussion over there. So it is not that you're thinking linearly all the time, you're also thinking laterally, and you're taking in all these observations and storing them in your hard disk somewhere. Each child is doing that, trust me. Again, painting stones and pebbles creates a good memory. We've had lots of children, Kids for Tigers, when I go to schools to talk to them. I often get presented with these pebbles with a tiger face on it or with a bird painted on it. And I have kept all of those pebbles because I feel it is something that the child has expressed from his heart. And he is sending out a message to me that he is with nature and he wants to do something for it. So it makes a big difference when children are allowed to express themselves in whichever way they can. These are just a few activities that I have suggested over here. In the rainy season, invariably, luckily for me, I have a lot of snails in my garden and earthworms and slugs and the whole works. So I would collect them and take them to school and allow the children to see them and watch them and observe them and then let them back into the garden at the end of the day. But this meant that the children were actually seeing something. A lot of teachers are afraid to handle these creatures because they are a little slimy, they may be cold to touch and stuff like that, but they're harmless creatures, trust me. Just a walk in nature, just a walk, just walk there on a path which is without cement and concrete and tar, and let the children see and come back and have a discussion on that. You will be surprised at the things that they have observed, which you have missed completely as an adult. But the children, being closer to the ground, are seeing things on the ground that you, from your adult height, cannot see or don't or miss completely. And there will be a lot of questions that will come out and which you will have to answer. But that is the beginning of curiosity and asking questions and seeking explanations and answers. And I think we need to really encourage that little bit. As Miel said, in the middle years, it is all about exploration. So think of ways in which you can give them a task which they have to observe and draw their own conclusions from. So creating butterfly gardens is a very easy task. It's not difficult at all. And butterflies will come flock to your little garden, whether it's on a windowsill, in the balcony, in one corner in your school. As long as the right flowers and plants are provided, the butterflies will come. And then you can observe and learn which are the butterflies that are coming, which season they arrive, when do they lay their eggs, what is the host plant required, what is the nectar plant required, and you are gathering information all the time. And not just the butterflies, you'll have bees visiting and you'll have ladybugs visiting and all those kinds of creatures. So it's going to be a lot of exploration and learning for them. Again, herb gardens can be planted at any point in time, anywhere, in small little pots. You don't need much space. Urban farming is what? Growing food, vegetables in pots, in available spaces, in containers, empty tel ka dabba, empty paint ka dabba. You don't need fancy containers. You just need the right soil mix, the seeds, and you need to look after them a little bit by providing them with the compost and stuff like that without any chemicals being added to it. And you'll have a flourishing urban farm which can give you tomatoes, chilies, coriander, palak, methi, brinjals, carrots, radish, all in containers. Trust me, because I have done it. I can say very confidently that it works. Again, just growing a stalk of jawar or bajra in your balcony will attract birds like sparrows, munias, parakeets, just to feed on them. And along with that, the pollination of those flowers, those tiny flowers on those stalks, is done by bees. So you're providing the bees something to feed on. And bees, which we all know are very, very important right now, are getting a place where they can go and feed and continue building their hives and create honey for us. Nature walks and hikes are always welcome. Spend the weekends out. I know the teachers want their weekends at home. I've been a teacher myself, but trust me, going out on the weekend with the kids is going to help you build a rapport with them, and you're going to be more friends and colleagues rather than, having that divide between teacher and student. And they will be able to trust you a lot more and share with you and discuss and talk and collaborate with you far better. As they grow older, 13, 14, 15 years old, automatically at that age, social consciousness begins to creep in. They tend to take a moral stand on several issues, which is natural, which comes with the teenage years. And if we channelize those thoughts and those ideas into positive action, it helps a lot, where we can get the children to speak to their friends, to get to speak to their uh, society members or hold rallies or have audits, and talk to others and tell them why it is necessary to do what they're doing in terms of electricity audits, water audits, garbage audits. Why is it important that we don't use single use plastics? Why is it important that we use reusable tumblers and cutlery and crockery, and we carry our own bottle of water everywhere, which is a metal bottle and not a plastic bottle? So, these are little things But these little things make a big difference. Imagine if your whole school stopped using plastic completely. Wouldn't that be a big drop in the number of people using plastic? And then this would then transfer into the family, and from the family into friends and into neighborhoods. And it would be the beginning of a, action that is taken, and it's like, a domino effect which goes on. You could also adopt traffic islands with the permission of the municipal local ward officer, and start growing food there. There are enough homeless people who will benefit from that, where they are getting free food and they will thank you for it. And at the same time, you're greening that place. It's not a rubbish dump. It is not something that is looking bad, and you're having food growing on that island. So these are some of the ideas that come to mind, and I think Aman also has a lot more to say about this. Another thing that I would just like to add before I hand over to Aman is that whenever we require information, whenever we require authentic information, please use sources that are authentic. Sanctuary Asia, Sanctuary Cup Kids are excellent resources in India. Also, there are several other resources that you could tap into, but these are easily available to you. These are India centric, and also talk about world issues that are happening across the globe. There is a mine of, I mean, there's a whole lot of information in the Cub Kids for children. The Sanctuary Asia magazine can be a resource for teachers. The Cub Kids can also be a resource for teachers in terms of what information do I give children when they ask me a question? How do I get more information about a certain animal? Or how do I explain to them what exactly is happening because of climate change? It's very difficult to bring it down to the level of a primary grade child who probably does not really understand everything, but it is easy enough when you have the information at your fingertips. So these subscriptions are available for free, and Aman will share the link with you. So these are some of what you get in the magazine, in the Sanctuary Cub magazine. So I hand over to Aman to take it forward. And I think after she's done, we can then open it up for discussion and sharing of ideas. Miel, what do you think?
Yes, sounds good. Aman, if you want to add anything about the activities, or jump in there, and then we can have, maybe Radhika can help us with moderating the
Yeah,
Q&A.
so just maybe two things. Like Preeti ma'am said that, okay, you can you can hear me, right? I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
So you can do activities with the younger ones. You can also kind of have a scavenger hunt where you can give them natural items to check in the nature. It can be a round pebble or a animal home or a y-shaped twig, something like that. That will help them connect with nature. That is one thing. Secondly, you can also do activities like, birding from your window. We all did that from in the month when we were all inside our home lockdown. We all have our phones, we all mostly have cameras. So you do biodiversity from my window, and you, or if you have a garden, you can go out, observe a tree, see the visitors, and make a list. And you can do that for the whole year if possible. If you have the time and thing like that, you can actually make a year long diary of the tree. That, okay, in the month of summer, this is the bird that visits, this is the bird that comes in the month of winter. So you understand, okay, these are the migrant birds and these are the resident ones. You will see the butterflies, you can understand the life cycles. That will basically help kids to connect, to grow. And if you can go to a forest patch, the same patch every different season, you can see how the forest changes. You can even, let your kids appreciate that how the forest is changing, how they can grow, uh, the connection between them and nature. These are like few, very very few simple examples that they can do. Photographs and making a checklist, I can if you are interested, I can help you with the Excel, I mean, sheet that they can observe for the observation, and they can note, and you as a teacher can help them in case they're not able to identify a tree or a bird. There are so many, experts available. We can just help you with that. I can share those resources as well we developed during the lockdown, so that can be done. So I think we can start with the question answers, because teachers
Before
would
I
have.
can, if I can just jump in here, another thought that came to my mind was creating a nature journal
Yeah,
where you are actually writing down your observations and sketching what you see in nature. Sometimes you can identify what you're seeing, sometimes you can't, but it is always a good documentation process where you are creating a journal of what you saw at what time, on which day, which year, and then go back, after a few months to see whether that same creature is visible again or not, or few years down the road, whether that creature is there in the vicinity or has gone completely from there. So nature journaling can be another activity that goes on for quite some time, and it is very good with the middle year children as well as the older children. So
yeah,
I'll stop sharing my screen now, and then we can go to question and answers or discussions.
yeah. Like, you'll be surprised that sometimes the most common birds are data deficient because we don't really bother to study them. So sparrows, when the numbers went down, there was, at that time there was no particular data whether they have really gone down or not, because they were data deficient. Nobody really studied them then. But now we have lots of data on sparrows. We don't want that to happen with all other birds. And when you start looking out, you can tell the kids to identify maybe 10 common birds around them, except the crows and the sparrows and miners, if they can identify those. Except for those 10 birds, sometimes it becomes difficult for them to, name the 10 birds that they can see around them. So let's do that. Not the brand names, but the bird names.
Before we start the question and answer, I would like to really, really thank the trio, the terrific trio that has really shared so much important information with us today. And there is a lot that we can do. The problem, what happens is one just feels that it's such a huge problem. What am I going to do? I can only put a drop in. But we must keep in mind that every drop makes a difference. And it always begins with a drop. And the drop is going to happen only if teachers can get the children enthused regarding these things that they should be talking about, caring about, and wanting to do something about. We must go with the premise that it can be done. I think if we begin to believe that we can make a difference, only then it will happen, because the problem is huge. And we cannot wait for governments to do it. They're not going to be able to do it on their own. So let us all get together and make all the tiniest difference that we can make. We must make it. And we will, Mehal and Preeti and Amandeep, we will definitely take your help. Definitely we are going to constantly ask you what more can be done. We've achieved so much. Is there anything else that can be done? And I expect that you are going to be available for doing that.
Definitely.
More than happy to help. More than happy.
Yeah.
For sure.
It's not enough to take a group of children for a trip. What has happened there has to, the word sustain is the important word. So thank you so much for the sharing. And this is not the end of it. We are going to be with you, and you are going to be with us on this journey.
Absolutely. No,
Thank you.
for having us, because really educators are where it's at. I mean, Preeti speaks to teachers and educators a lot. And I think, you like they say, one teacher is involved, and that's hundreds of people.
Yes, actually, that's the point. One teacher can affect so many children every year that, and then they, as you said, the little child who goes home and tells the grandparent that, we must do this. It has its effect. And we must count on that. And they will do it. They will go to their neighbors and they will talk. So thanks a lot, and thank you very much to all the teachers who have attended this session. You have always supported us, and we want to bring more and more sessions like this. If you have an idea about what some other sessions can be, please get in touch with us so that we can try and find a resource person who can bring that to you. Ishita, you have made a comment, and it would be nice if you can share it with us. Ishita Verma.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Ishita.
Okay. No, so very interestingly, I have always wondered. I have also been an SS teacher, English teacher, pre-primary, and I think, Nandita, you know me, I have always been deeply connected with nature, and education begins there, not in the classroom. But I have always wondered why we always talk about nature as being distinctly separate from us humans. Are we not a part of nature? So, in seeking the nature connection, I think the first thing we need to do is actually look within ourselves and find that nature connection inside. I think thereafter the solution is just going to come automatically.
Yes, absolutely, Ishita. We are talking about animals as nature, birds as nature, but what about humans as nature?
Exactly, exactly.
Absolutely a part of it. We are just one more species.
No, absolutely. Some of the things they found with this nature deficit disorder and the disconnection, we very just gently skimmed over this idea of the spiritual grounding that you lose when you lose the nature connection, because somebody else may call it God, somebody else may call it nature. It's some people have different words for it, but the point is this is the substrate of which we are all a part of it, and there is no difference. We are a part of nature, we are not apart from it. And that is the very basic foundational premise on which any of this discussion is based, is to repair that flawed thinking. The ancients that Preeti was talking about in the beginning didn't feel disconnected in any way. They understood that we are all one. When you say we are all one, it's everything, right? So yes, you're absolutely right, Ishita. I think that has to be point number one, and repairing number one that has to happen.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Miel. Thank you, Preeti. Thank you, Amandeep.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having
Thank you
us.
so
Thank
much.
you very
Thank
much.
you for having us. Yes. Thank you. Bye.
And thank you to all the teachers for being here. Thank
Yes.
you.